Thank you, Roxy, and welcome everybody to our noon panel discussion and seminar. We came off a wonderful discussion this morning on becoming an existential humanistic psychologist and therapist, and on our way on what I'm calling the USS Div 32 voyage this weekend. So welcome back. And we're very excited to engage in our discussion this afternoon. I want to introduce Dr. Betz King and Dr. Adam Duberstein and have them, if they would like to introduce any other panelists that will be discussing with them. Dr. Betz King is with us as a member of our executive board here at the Society for Humanistic Psychology. She is also a member, an editor, board member for the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and is very active in the APA with in divisions 17 and 13 as well around human-animal interactions. That's a special thing for me because my daughter is interested in animal intelligence and cross-species communication. So when I'm whirling around, I reach out to Betz for help. And so she understands about speciesism and bridging all kinds of sentient forms of being. I also want to welcome Dr. Adam Duberstein, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and educator with the Southern New Hampshire University and with Michigan School of Professional Psychology. He's in private practice as well in Hazel Park, Michigan. So they are going to lead a group of panelists and us in a discussion that I'm looking forward to called The Philosopher's Stone, Existential Humanistic Psychology in the Here and Now of Managed Care. Doctors King and Duberstein.
Thank you, Todd. What a lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us at the Society for Humanistic Psychology's 15th annual conference. I'm Betz King. I'm an existential humanistic psychologist in metropolitan Detroit and a proud graduate of the Center for Humanistic Studies, an even more proud member of the Division 32 Executive Board, as Todd said. And I'm joined today by my co-facilitator, Dr. Adam Duberstein, and 3 other early career clinicians who I have the joy of working existentially with at my practice, King and Associates. Because much of our work takes place within the paradigm of insurance mandates, I have always taught, both academically and in supervision, how to practice from an existential humanistic orientation within managed care environments. Today's speakers are some of the best I know at successfully working this way. Depending on your age, you might associate our main title, The Philosopher's Stone, with the first of the Harry Potter novels, where the stone promised immortality. Or you might, like me, recall the Van Morrison song of the same name, and in particular these lyrics, "It's a hard road. Even my best friends, they don't know that my job is turning lead into gold. It's a hard road searching for the philosopher's stone." I've always considered therapy to be an alchemical process, whether we're talking about helping clients make enough meaning to rise like that immortal phoenix from the ashes of whatever has befallen them, or we're cultivating presence and encounters that allow for the transformation of lead protections into golden authenticity. EH practitioners offer what Kirk Schneider calls experiential liberation. We hope that you will enjoy our conversation about the joys and challenges of working this way. And we ask that you put your questions in the chat for later in the presentation. So let's meet today's panel discussants.
Hello, I'm Brian Peterson. Graduated with my master's in clinical psychology in 2017 from the Michigan School of Psychology, and I've been working with King and Associates ever since, with individuals, adolescents and adults for a variety of concerns. I also worked for a year with inpatient substance use disorder treatment in individual and group therapy. In addition to existential humanistic methods, I like to focus on acceptance and commitment therapy and working with the Enneagram in treatment.
Brian, Andrea?
Hi, my name is Andrea Brent. I've been working with King and Associates since 2018. I am a fourth-year doctoral student at the Michigan School of Psychology, and my areas of practice are older adults and adults with chronic illness, a lot of variety of health issues, and death and dying concerns.
And my name is Dylan Oseas, and I'm a PsyD student at Michigan School of Psychology and also got my master's degree there. I've been working remote since the pandemic, so I've been moved around all the way through the country, but I am coming April moving back to Michigan. I'm really excited to do that.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Duberstein, and I will celebrate my year anniversary with King and Associates on Friday. So
Yay.
That's exciting. I just finished my doctorate in July of 2021 from the Michigan School of Psychology, which is where I also got my master's. I worked in crisis intervention. I've worked in private practice like I do now. And I've also worked in a brain injury clinic. I work a lot with trauma, health issues, men's issues, and identity concerns. It's mostly what I do.
Thanks, Adam.
And so with that said, let me talk a little bit about what existential humanistic therapy is. And we were debating earlier about what it was, because there could be several definitions and they could all be right. Dylan had pointed out Yalom's definition, which is what I think resonated most with me. I'll be curious to see if it resonates with you as well, where Irvin Yalom said that existential psychotherapy is a dynamic approach to therapy, which focuses on concerns that are rooted in an individual's existence. I was going to say that significantly in a less eloquent way, saying that there was kind of a marriage between Maslow, who talks about the things that we need, and the existential givens, which boils down the problems that we face. And I identify as an existential humanistic practitioner because existential humanistic therapy values client dignity, sees human potential, and also is very elegant and simple when it comes to understanding the range of human problems while respecting the range of human diversity. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you, Adam. So before I even came into the field of clinical psychology, I held a bachelor's in behavioral neuroscience and pretty much a master's in biochemistry. So what brought me into existential therapy were the terms freedom, choice, and responsibility. And just a little, clip of how why I've chosen this is, jumping off of what Adam said of, preserving dignity and maintaining dignity. The client holds the power for how they want to move in the session. And I provide that space to help them access that power within, to give themselves the permission to move through that. And I think, I don't know how many opportunities they have to access that space, but part of what I try to do is always give them, I keep coming back to space, and I always keep coming back to freedom, choice, and responsibility. And I can hold that space, I can provide that space, and it's always up to the client to show us where we want to go. And as vague and open-ended as that sounds, it has been the most powerful treatment I have seen thus far. So that is all for me.
Thanks, Andrea. When you say space, I also think of encounter. So maybe it's space for the encounter, the I, thou. Thank you. Dylan?
Hello. So I'll be honest, before I came to MSP, a few years ago, I didn't know what existential therapy is. And in fact, I had such a misconception of even the word existential that I was wondering, like, is this therapy for ghosts? Like, what are we doing here? What is this? But what attracted to me to it once I actually like realized what it was is like, I grew up in a Montessori environment, which is very, very similar to humanistic existential in terms of values, freedom, being able to be a human and have the whole be better than the sum of the parts. And also, you know, regardless of how strongly the general psychology community wants to take a very positivist attitude towards psychology and find the absolute truth, we're very uniquely existential creatures at a biological level. We are one of the few animals, at least the only animal that we know that can think existentially or aware of our own existence. So the idea that it wouldn't be important to bring that up and process that when it comes to mental health doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel accurate to how we are as humans. And that is something that's really stuck with me and made me want to pursue existential psychology further and get more in depth with it.
I like the comparison between Montessori and what we do.
Yeah, for myself, after graduating from undergrad, I was feeling really uninspired and actually left the idea of becoming a therapist behind for a number of years. And I chose existential humanistic as a philosophy because there was nothing else that attracted me in psychology. And so literally I wouldn't be a therapist right now if I hadn't heard about the program at the Michigan School of Psychology and went there. And what really drew me in is just that it really resonated with my own experiences of personal growth. Like that holistic approach resonated with me as far as this is how people grow and get better as people. So.
Thanks, Brian. I was trying to answer this question and I realized I couldn't name a time when I became an existential humanistic practitioner because I'm an Enneagram 4 and I think we're just born that way. But I had a wonderful experience in my master's degree at the Center for Humanistic Studies of for quite a while thinking that everything I read and everything I was being taught, my first response was, well, yeah. You know, sort of like, So I found my home instantly and I felt validated and I felt seen and understood, and it's never not been the thing that I want to do. So I know that each of you have a handful of private pay clients, which is a little more liberating in the places that you can go. But mostly you're providing therapy reimbursed by third-party payers. And that type of managed care often determines the type and duration of treatment provided. And it also, I think, inserts this invisible other into the therapy space. And it requires documentation that I tried very hard to teach you to make both true and billable. And there's some tension there. And this creates what Morlock called a gulf between the experiential word of treatment and the medical behavioral discourse necessary to adopt for insurance. And I know you all have the same insurance auditor that I do on my shoulder when you're writing your notes and you're trying to say both everything and nothing and make it billable. That requires that we extract pieces of information from what we do out of this rich, full context. And then we rearrange them into these alternative narratives that are factually accurate, but they're only a fragment and they're very colonized and they do not capture the magic. So my next question for the panel is, how does this faceless other of managed care impact your work as an existential humanistic practitioner? We can start with you, Adam.
Thanks, Betz. So I was thinking about this, and managed care has really been legislated for us. Just as an aside, I'm very political and I'm pretty active with a political party. I'm also active with, as an elected official. I'm on the library board in my town, so I know I can't declare war, but I feel very strongly that APA is advocated for a long time for managed care. Also, the EPPP and SciPact are incredibly politically charged issues. And all of those issues that I mentioned, all of the things that I mentioned, have a connection to managed care in some way or another. There's not enough time to get bogged down in those details, but I don't think that psychologists think about as much as they should the political, how managed care and the political system are interwoven with one another. And I hope to encourage that today as we to think about that.
So are you saying, Adam, that how you work with this tension is you understand that the personnel is political?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Andrea.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess how I work with managed care as an existential psychotherapist is I do my best to translate. And like I said a moment ago, right, I've got a very, science-oriented, evidence-based, bachelor's degree. And I put that in quotes because it's one thing to see, data points and, things like that. So but it's also another thing to feel and really experience that change, which, to not go too much on a tangent, I'm aware of my my time constraints, but it's an interesting balancing act to do. And I think for insurance companies, we tend to be encouraged to speak CBT. And as Dr. King was just saying, this balancing the truth and billable, I think that is very limiting in a lot of ways. So that's essentially what I do is I work on a translation piece. I work on a really trying to put into context what is going on and really opening up the opportunity for that experience to shine through as a mechanism of change as opposed to very stringent thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. I think what we do is a lot more than that. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Andrea. One of my favorite memories of you when you first came aboard was you had to explain treatment to an insurance company to ask for some more sessions in a fairly critical case that involved a gun, I believe, and was sort of scary for everyone involved. And we got out the DSM and we got out the treatment planner that tells you what's billable. And we brought the very existential details of that case to someone on the phone who had the power to say yes or no. And I do think that your background in the sciences makes you a skilled linguist in interpreting and translating, because as I recall, you got all the sessions you wanted and that case ended in a really favorable way.
Thank you. I believe the data point at this point becomes dollars and cents and outcome, but thank you. Yeah, that was a pretty powerful experience there.
Yeah, for me personally, I don't think about managed care a lot in my day-to-day work. I really like that's what you said about capturing the magic or not capturing the magic. And I don't aim to capture the magic in my documentation. I don't think that's what it's for, and I don't think I can, because the documentation is there to highlight what is billable. So I let it be that, and I focus in my work and doing what I need to do, and what's most important to me, which is sort of living out my values as a therapist in session with my clients. And that's just this extra layer of bureaucratic stuff to me that I don't give too much thought to, thanks to Betz's guidance in how to manage and navigate all of that.
Thank you.
So my experience with managed care comes from in my 20s, I decided to pursue being in a band touring, and so put off graduate school for nearly a decade. But I worked as a case manager at a community mental health center, which was one of the huge ones with like 7 different buildings, hundreds of therapists, kind of that quasi Medicaid billing model. And one of the problems that I see is that in some ways managed care is a good thing, that it really extends what treatment can be, like, underserved populations and how they can get treatment. And it really like casts a wider net than your more traditional therapy models. However, the way it's set up, that I really noticed, that I got to watch, like, so I would have a lot of interaction with the actual therapists, have access to their treatment plans, be in sessions with them, it reminded me a lot of how it works in schools right now, where it's like teaching people to the test, right? It gets rid of any kind of wiggle room. Oftentimes managed care has a lot of very young practitioners with not a lot of experience thrown into some really high instances of trauma. And then if that client doesn't do well, it's like, well, that client was just resistant. That client didn't, they don't, it was like, there was no chance for that client to have choice. If they didn't like that therapist, well then, okay, they're just not appreciating the services, and we should just kind of push them out. So for me, even though that has like help, it kind of forces me to feel an irreverence towards the whole model, and how it's preached as the best way and the way to do it. And that to me is where I feel irreverence and want to push back a little bit, not because I think managed care should go away, but I just don't think that the way they're doing it has to be the way they do it. I think that there can be, like Adam was saying, getting involved politically, or changing things, or changing just the way that, insurance companies view mental health, or courts view mental health. I had a court designated worker once tell me, this client's been seeing a therapist for 3 months, why aren't they better yet? And their entire history, their entire future was on the line in terms of what that court designated worker was going to set up for this person in terms of services and freedom. So there's a lot of systemic issues and a lot of bureaucratic things that I've witnessed that need a lot of work. And yeah, that makes me just appreciate existential therapy even more. And I don't think that existential therapy doesn't belong in managed care. I think it might actually help.
One place, thanks, Dylan, that it helped me. I think if what's that saying? You have to know the rules well enough to break them. And I certainly did not break the rules, so maybe I misspeak. But in the 90s, those of you in community mental health will recall that the person-centered plan and person-centered choice was a big deal, and clients got to sort of say what they wanted to do and who they wanted at the table with them when they did it. And I loved this because it spoke right to my humanistic heart. And so I sort of had a recipe where we had 2 goals that fit their diagnosis. If there was a legal goal, we'd cover that. But then we had the goal of their heart. What did they want to do? And that was clearly our favorite. And there was a fellow once who wanted a girlfriend more than anything. And he was a seriously and persistently mentally ill CMH client of many years. And I sat down to write the treatment plan with him and get him a girlfriend in managed care language. And it looked something like, client will go to the coffee house 3 times a week, right? Because this has to be measurable and objective. Client will start 2 conversations each time he goes to the coffee house. After 12 conversations, client will ask a girl for her phone number. I don't know. I just made it measurable and objective and thought, how do you get a girlfriend? He got a girlfriend, and I lost track of him, but that chart was pulled by, I don't know, CARF or some big grand poobah organization as the exemplary example of the person-centered plan. They just loved the get a girlfriend goal. And so that's what I've called it ever since, the get a girlfriend goal. So Dylan mentioned the benefits of managed care, I think. The most obvious, I think, being that it allows people to participate in therapy for $10 or $20 when they might not be able to afford it at full fee. And Andrea suggested when we were talking that it holds clinicians accountable for client welfare a little bit. But there's a lot more challenges, I think, to working in this paradigm, well named and described by our panelists. And so I think the meat and the potatoes of this presentation or tofu, that I was really looking forward to are talking about how we do it. How do we do it? The daily work of providing existential humanistic therapy. Brian, would you like to start us out?
I would love to. So, right, how do I do therapy? Well, I really like the metaphor of a trail or a path for therapy. I invoke it often with my clients, and it's a way to describe a lot of different things we do together. When we start, we're meeting each other either at the trailhead or I'm catching up with them somewhere along the trail. We don't know what the trail is going to look like. We can guess or infer some things about it, but we don't really know. And so I keep coming back to that in many ways throughout therapy. When a client feels like, well, I was able to do this 2 weeks ago and I can't do it now. What's wrong with me? What's happening? Oh, it's okay. We just didn't know there was like a little loop in this trail, and we just walked it and we just learned some more things, or your understanding deepened. So that's fine. We're just going to keep going. We didn't know that loop was there. It was there. Now we'll keep going forward. But so meeting the client where they're at and sort of letting them lead, I think as Andrea spoke to earlier, is a big part of what I do. I work a lot with acceptance and commitment therapy, and I feel that existential humanistic and acceptance and commitment therapy dovetail quite nicely in many ways. As far as looking at, well, we have to meet your needs for you to self-actualize. Acceptance and commitment therapy says we have to remove the sort of barriers to you acting in alignment with your own values, which is causing distress to the extent to which you can't act in alignment with your own values. And there are lots of other ways these two connect up, but I tend to conceptualize of therapy in acceptance and commitment therapy terms in general, and look at how do we get you to be able to still do what it is that, you know, your values say to do, despite all of these things you're feeling and going through. So some ways this connects to existential humanistic therapy, I think, is in mindfulness is a big thing that's extremely useful. You know, looking at how we instill mindfulness or get people to go into mindfulness, I think encouraging awe in clients about what is happening in the present is one way that I get them to do it, because there's a lot of existential dread that comes up when I ask clients to be mindful, because we're asking them to be exposed to all of these things they're afraid of and hiding from normally. So I get them to pay attention and realize, like, look at all the things that are happening every moment, all the stimuli you can attend to. I bring attention to the fact that we actually live our whole lives in one moment that just keeps going until it doesn't go anymore. And that the present or the past and future are hypothetical in many ways. Presence is also something that requires mindfulness. I use mindfulness to be present with my clients every day. If there's something going on in my life or in my head, I just return to my breathing in order to be present with my clients. And I help create presence with feed-forward body language, letting them know I'm open, I'm listening, verbal and nonverbal cues that I'm paying attention, making noises, repeating words, phrases, summarizing, clarifying. And dealing with resistance, I like to use motivational interviewing techniques, as well as some other things, but I like rolling with resistance, doing reflective listening, and encouraging the client to come up with their own solutions. And another way that aligns with acceptance and commitment therapy is developing discrepancy between sort of the manifestation of the resistance and their previously stated values and goals. It's something that works really well. I think it's also, and part of meeting the client where they are, it's important to sort of intuitively choose the right moment for a confrontation about resistance, or recognizing when, well, we've pushed far enough for right now, and they don't need that at this moment, or that wouldn't be helpful at this moment. And I like to explicitly discuss resistance with my clients and explain resistance, why it's happening, what is it, what do we do with it. I actually, in a previous life, I went to school for education for a while, and I really like the idea, this term, the zone of proximal development, or the zone of proximal learning is what they call it, but I like to think of it as a zone of proximal development. Like, is what I want to, is this intervention in what they're in the realm of what they are capable of at this moment. And those goalposts move as the client grows and heals. But it's a useful thing for me to think about with terms of resistance. How much do I push that or let it go for now? I think acceptance and commitment therapy lines up really well with the sort of givens of existence and existential concerns that we have, because a lot of times they're aligned with the values. And in acceptance and commitment therapy, you can say that a person's distress is the flip side of the coin of their values. And so you can follow distress to sort of what is valuable to them, what they're concerned about, what they believe. And a lot of times this connects to their existential concerns, like especially meaning. Very quickly it becomes obvious when a person isn't living a life that they value and has a lot of meaning for them, and they express it. And that's a great time to talk about existential concerns and meaning. And I do that in therapy. They just tend to come up quite organically. And death, I think death is a great friend of mindfulness, because death tells us we should pay attention to what is happening, because it's not going to be happening forever. And every moment that you live with your head in the clouds is another moment that you will never experience fully. So real, true, deep awareness and acceptance of death, I think, really helps us to focus on how we want to live, and shine the spotlight on the need to clear up all of this stuff. So that's a bit about how I work with my clients, and I think I'll leave it there.
Ryan, I think that's my new favorite quote. Death is the friend of mindfulness.
Great.
So I'll talk a little bit about how I work as a therapist. Brent's a tough act to follow. So talk a little bit first about awe. One of the things I always like to ask clients on intake is, what do they like to do for fun? And I like to follow that question up with, what are you curious about? Because if we can spark their curiosity and also at the same time show them some of their own talents that they may have, perhaps we can make things just a little bit, tiny bit better for them. I also think about, I also encourage them to share good news with me too. So I'll give an example. I had a client who went on a trip. This was someone I was seeing yesterday, and the client shared some pictures of the nature trail that they walked on in the mountains of the trip. And I really want to encourage that, because that also promotes a sense of awe and wonder. And it also gives me a better sense of coping skills that I can help the client to use. The other thing I think about with presence and encounter is it kind of shift gears a little, is being there. I always think of it as I walk alongside the client. So it's not me leading them places, and it's not them really leading me. I walk with them, and I consider myself a little bit of a collector of stories. I'm always interested in people's stories. I was like the little nosy kid in the neighborhood growing up, who had to watch everybody, what was going on everywhere. Well, it paid off 20 or so years, 30 so years later. But I like to walk alongside my clients, hearing their stories, making them feel as though their dignity is respected. And that's one of the things that made me fall in love with humanistic psychology, is the fact that it's the only theory that I'm aware of, and there may be others out there, that really talks about the dignity of the person. The other thing I think about too in presence and encounter, ironically enough, is Maslow's hierarchy. I see Maslow's hierarchy there because, and I saw this a lot when I was doing crisis work. I had a lot of homeless clients at the time, and if they didn't have food and shelter, they didn't care about getting a job. And if they didn't have a job, they didn't care about making friends. So there definitely is a progression of needs throughout. And I think about us being present then to witness their growth, and not just paying attention in the session, but also, being present over time, watching them grow over time. Resistance, I'm thinking about that too. And that is a very, very tough thing to deal with. I won't lie that that's possibly the most challenging aspect of doing therapy for me anyway. Sometimes it's trying to understand the reasons for the client's resistance, which again, I think goes back to that whole piece of dignity. And maybe they're also not ready to be in therapy yet, or maybe they're not ready to discuss what's going on. And that could be, and that's okay too, for some people that just, when they're not ready, they're not ready. So one of the things I think about too with resistance is kind of rolling with resistance. When it's there, we have to acknowledge that it's there, and just kind of working with it as it shows up. So what I mean by that is not really getting upset with the client, always being respectful, all that whole unconditional positive regard piece, but understanding kind of the why of resistance. Why is it happening? And what do we need to do to help them to feel less resistant, or to turn the resistance into some kind of growing moment for them? And there are lots of ways to do that. Goes back to the whole genuineness piece, I think. I think that people are less resistant to a therapist who is genuine. I always conceptualize my cases existentially, and I always think about different clients in an existential way. Specifically, I feel like a lot of the problems that we deal with as therapists, or at least that I see, are issues of freedom. I'm thinking of a client who I've had for a long time, who's trying to figure out whether or not they should, what will happen if they leave their partner. And the freedom of it is what's scaring them from trying something new. They've also made meaning out of their experience with their partner. And that meaning is especially significant for many reasons. So because of that, it's been hard for the person to move forward. With that said, though, I understand why the person's having trouble moving forward, because of those aspects, because they're fearing freedom, because they've made meaning of their experience with their partner. And I think that freedom really is is wonderful, and it's really what I think a lot of people are seeking, but it also can be overwhelming, because oftentimes, especially when kids are growing up, they're not given a choice. So one of the things I think we are charged with as humanistic therapists, as humanistic existential therapists, is to give people some choice and a chance to kind of sharpen critical thinking skills to make the right choices for them. So that's part of what I feel like we do in many ways. And then with all that said, I'll turn it over to Dylan.
Hello again. So one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that existential issues right now are coming up with and feel more relevant than I've at least thought in the past. You know, we've got war, we've just getting through a pandemic. We had weird situations with elections, and and even like organized religion is not nearly as popular as before. So a lot of people's existential, framework has been collapsing a bit, especially in kids. There's no longer like, it's less likely that you're going to have very predetermined sets of beliefs than it used to be. So what I've noticed, even with, like a 14-year-old client, is that, I get a lot of my information on what is going on with people her age. Kids are even starting to take things into their own hand existentially. And like, they're getting very, like, there's still this need, regardless of if religion is present or not. And that comes in the form of they create stories for themselves. They create a narrative that it can be kind of magical, even like they're the main character in a story. They're the one, and what I kind of think when I hear her talk is us as adults being able to talk existentially with people, and kids included. It reminds me of being able to talk about sex. Where do we really want to have kids just figure that out totally by themselves without any guidance? Like, why is that off the table for talking with younger people? And I think it is just very, very relevant. And I noticed that with a lot of, without me prompting it and using my existential theoretical orientation, existential issues come up. The Ford worker who has a good job and a union rep and wonders, like, is this it? Right? Like, do we CBT him to just think about it differently? Like, that doesn't feel right. Like, can you really engage him in terms of, like finding meaning in that and then figuring out like he responded very well to that. And he had been to other therapists who wanted to kind of just, get him an action plan and do some very, other things. And he kind of felt like he wasn't being heard. And I just noticed, all of the, Yalom's existential givens just keep coming up. And I think it's just important to be able to talk about it. People get really put off if you can't engage with that. I've had people report that if you can't have a discussion, or if you get uncomfortable when somebody really wants to talk about death or, meaninglessness, they're going to be able to tell. And that's what Adam's saying, like the authenticity. Like, if they can't sense that from me, if you can't engage them that level, I don't think it doesn't feel right to me. And they can even be used as tools. Like I noticed, I really enjoy talking to clients about existential isolation, especially when I'm talking to people who are having difficulty with empathy. Because I notice, oftentimes people will think, I've had clients who are like, I feel like I'm a robot or I'm a bad person. So starting with existential isolation being, essentially the idea that like you were born into this world by yourself and you will die by yourself in your head. Nobody will be able to enter actually your brain except for you. And giving people that prompt early on when trying to develop empathy really helps. I've found, at least my practice, it's helped set the expectation on what empathy actually is, and the idea that empathy, like anything else, is aspirational. Like, I can be a very empathetic person, but I can't fully ever know what anybody is actually feeling. Nobody can ever fully know what I'm feeling. But then kind of getting that cultivation of awe, the curiosity, it's like, okay, so how do we get closer to it? Like, what can you do? Okay, maybe you don't feel specific emotions, you don't have that internal, sympathetic nervous system response that triggers you to feel empathy, but what else can we do to get closer to that? Like, and that's why I like using ACT. Where how do you get closer to your values? How do you bring your values in there? How do you create a code for yourself? What do you stand for? And how do you just get closer? And that feels so much more, it feels very genuine to me. And, you see them kind of perk up and lighten up. And I really like that feels good when I'm doing this. And I wouldn't want to not be allowed to do that. And I think in terms of writing notes and using existential language, I like Ack's kind of view of words are just words. And I kind of just decide, I choose personally to not really care what my notes say and if they reflect the true meaning of my sessions. In fact, I like to almost make them the opposite. I almost don't want to include the fact that we had this really deep, interesting discussion about a nuanced thing. Like that can be on my notes on my notepad, but there's part of me that actually kind of likes keeping that from billers who, like, I don't want them to read that. It's not their business. As the case manager, I've talked to enough people and seen where those notes can go. Like I've had to talk to people in Florida who were reading my notes, trying to decide whether or not they were going to give me services, and had me talk to some random, like, I don't want them reading the intimate conversations that we're having. That's not their business. Like, just get in there, and like, I don't really have a problem with having my notes just be very cut and dry for the sake of, for the sake of bureaucracy. However, where that does have its limits is I do feel uncomfortable with the idea that if I did decide, or if I was a person who had more regard to words, if I decided to include that, I don't like that could be a red flag for auditors. And I think that's something where maybe work needs to be done, or somebody who is, more in tune with that side might want to think about. But in general, part of me even kind of almost likes, I almost kind of like that there's a little bit of that like humanistic maverick nature to it. I wonder if it gives this part of psychology a little more friction that motivates us to all do better work. And I'm wondering if other people agree with that. But that's how I feel. I feel like it gives me more motivation to learn the language of other theoretical orientations, so that I can, in my head, kind of weave everything together and have an explanation in various type of styles for the same thing that I'm doing, regardless of what theoretical orientation it actually is. So maybe it's a good thing for us that we have to battle this, with the bigger, higher APA. Maybe it'll make us better.
Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you.
I hear you mentioning the only limitation I can think of regarding EH therapy, which we promised we would tag today, the lack of research that everybody here is working very hard to change. So go team. Maybe sometimes the philosophical conversations could be difficult for clients unfamiliar with the language, but I think we are all outstanding at translating and interpreting for our intended audiences. So I think we can make those concepts known to anybody walking through our door. That's one of the things I'm very proud of about each of you. Andrea, what would you add?
Well, I'm usually good for having conversations about death. But I will start with, as everybody else as part of the team and the panel was talking, I was thinking of how can I draw some, common themes with, my clientele. And the interesting thing is that I can't, right? And I can and I can't. I don't want to. And primarily because as we're talking about the existential, humanistic type of, treatment, I don't want a one size fits all discussion. I don't know if you guys do either. So this presence and encounter, I'll tell you how I tend to open up a brand new session is I'll have my, discussion of, okay, what would you like to talk about? What brings you in? I'll have my confidentiality and, procedures and policies, discussion with them so that they know their limitations of what they can say and when I mandate report, all of that policy stuff, right? That is also important to know what is safe and what is, what is our next steps. But after that, I say, let me just start this out, okay? Happy to tell you about my qualifications. If you came here, somebody probably told you something about how I work. My name. You can look me up. I will gladly run down my credentials with you. popping it out to you. You are the master of your experience. So we're going to develop some goals. You're going to tell me what is meaningful and important to you. And you can tap into my, 20 plus years of experience to give you some options. You are the one who will ultimately tell me if that works for you or if that doesn't. I really cultivate, maybe I take this from Planet Fitness. I said, I really cultivate a judgment-free zone, because in that judgment, I said, we all carry our own inner critic with us. And I am not here to echo that inner criticism. I'm here to help you move through that, because I think that's a very natural limitation that, probably what brought you into see me anyways. And that's going to sound different for everybody at every given moment in time. So that's why I can't draw parallels as much as I would like to about how I encounter, the client and how I cultivate presence. I don't script my sessions. I know what works for me, and I also know what, you go where you're going to go, eventually. In terms of speaking about death, I talk a lot about death. I talk about the physical aspects of death. I work with a lot of individuals with chronic illness, particularly Huntington's disease. I work with people with a variety of brain injuries. So knowing now the limitations of what an acquired brain injury has, how that's impacted their life. So these are very real physical limitations. And how do you move through them? How do you move with them? How do you move away from that grief? How do you move with that grief? So a lot of movement and a lot of death of, potential death of a physical self, death of a former self, right? Death of an old thought pattern, right? And one of the ways that I do that in a lot of different ways, but some of my common language is back to that choice and freedom and responsibility. You are the only one who can make that choice when you are ready to do it. Right. So if other people are saying, throw away the cane, you don't need the cane, right? You don't need the cane, right? I ask the question of what are you holding on to? There's probably, in my mind, there's probably some fear underneath it. I'm going to let the client name that. So when we talk about resistance, I also honor that resistance, because it's not me holding on to that cane. It's not me who is sitting here with that diagnosis. It's not me who has to take those next steps. I'm here to hold that space, and I am not here to judge you. But I do want to access, what does that inner critic say, right? What are you giving power to, and what is taking power away from you? Those are very open-ended questions. And I also, invite the client, if you don't have an answer, that's okay, right? I'm just right, as Adam was talking about, sparking that curiosity. These are curiosities in a lot of different ways. But it's that welcoming the new self when and how it presents. I think maybe with managed care, I don't want to put necessarily it onto that, but just expectations in general. This element of change, I think we take a very finite view to it, where change has to be absolute. And I will argue that it's more of a process. I will argue that it takes, steps and choice, and there is fear each time, because when we go back to the brain, anybody knows me, I can talk about brains all day. Our brain likes those shortcuts. Our brain doesn't like to make choices. Our brain likes to just do what it normally does and maintain the status quo. Clients do not come to me to stay the same. So part of that is trying to access their inner critic and speaking back to the inner critic with self-compassion, right? I will offer self-compassion, but if somebody's holding on to those inner critical messages, I become curious and I say, well, what are you holding on to, right? And what does it mean for you to hold on? And what does it mean for you to let go? And I'm not saying I want you to change anything. I just want you to try to name it and try to bring it into the here and now. And for that to happen, it means I don't come in with a script. I certainly come in with a plan, and some goals, but at the end of the session, I say, what did you take away from the session? What was helpful? What was not helpful, right? What was helpful, I want to do more of if it warrants it. What's not helpful, I want to do less of, right? What are you paying for? What are we spending our money on? What are we spending our time on? right? And more so, I want you to get as much out of this time, this experience as you can. I've had clients come into, my, virtual office and say, Andrea, oh no, I only have time for 30 minutes today. And I'm like, well, I said, what happened? Oh, I didn't sleep. I want to just, but I wanted to make the appointment. And I would counter with, is this something that you can be fully present for 30 minutes? Or did you rush to make the appointment and is it better to reschedule? Well, I just, I'm mindful of your time and I appreciate that. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate that. But is this something where we're going to, if you are not fully present, what do we do? The choice is yours. I will absolutely sit with you for 30 minutes. Billable or not, whatever, I'll deal with that. That's my choice. My choice. But right, you see their inner critic. I've had a lot of, of speaking to self-acceptance. It's also a challenge. That's also, freedom, choice, responsibility at every given moment. Sometimes I'm very connected to myself and sometimes I'm not. What a very powerful conversation I've had in a few different ways is acceptance without helplessness. When you use that word accept, I usually don't bring up that word because I had in the past and it has sparked that helplessness. Oh, I just have to accept the way things are. In parentheses, I have no power to change it. I have no power to move through it. I have no freedom. I have no choice. So we talked about, so I let the client bring up that word. Oh, I just have to accept it. What does it, whatever it is, what does that mean for you to accept it? And then I bring in that temporality piece, that accepting this for now, how can you accept it? By accessing power within, by moving through it. Is this a power over type of thing you have to accept where, this is telling you that you need to, do something that's really not within your value systems? Can you access a power with to accept the situation, to make it more palatable? How do you access power within? And doing all of that, I think has some conversations of speaking to whatever messages of judgment, of criticism, of you're not enough, you're not doing enough, you're not being enough, not spending enough, right? You're not doing enough. Helping the client access self-compassion, but also giving them the choice that if you want to hold on to that, this is where I am right now, and this is where I'm going to be. Okay, then that's not resistance. That's, if that's where you are, that's where you are. And so clearly, in discussions, you can, I can go all day, with this, but when, I also talk about energy, right? So I know I just talked a lot about death and acceptance. I talk a lot about energy, and for me, I access my my inner science nerd, and I usually do a brief psycho ed if we haven't had biochemistry in a long time. I talk about potential energy and kinetic energy. So, when somebody comes, I'm not doing enough, or that's the theme. I'm not doing enough, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, etc. Right? I say, well, what are we holding, right? What is that internal movement going on? And then I access my inner science teacher, and I talk about potential energy is that energy that builds up with bodies at rest. Kinetic energy is energy of things in motion. Maybe right now you're just holding. And if that's all you're doing, at least you're not moving down, you're not moving back. And if you are, right, that's another discussion. But that's okay too, because then we build that momentum. So I do a lot of access my inner chemistry teacher voice, but I talk about that kind of energy as well to help that person hold where they are and accept where they are, even if they're at rest, without judgment, and movement in terms of, here we go, let's see how that goes. And if you want to change course, that's okay too. Right. So always, keeping those options open and allowing yourself the acceptance of the new self until that new self becomes more of a pattern and the old self has moved away. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks,
But
Andrea.
in a snapshot, that's what I do.
Well, and I'm going to brag about you for a second because I think you have a really interesting clinical and occupational challenge. Certainly working with the Huntington's population, freedom within limits is all you do, right? Their freedom to live the way they are going to live with that disease, knowing how it ends. And to that end, Andrea has been asked to sort of develop an assessment for Huntington's programs to use when determining if someone should be allowed to come into their program. These are usually hospital-based programs, but they're asking Andrea if she can develop sort of a readiness to die evaluation, or basically what they're not saying is, can you make sure that if we let this person into our program with this diagnosis, they won't kill themselves? Can you make sure that this person is strong enough to run the clock out in a way that doesn't get us sued? And Andrea has said, well, yes, I can. And so we're working on that, and it's super exciting. And I'm hoping you'll see an article soon, sooner or later. So thanks, Andrea.
Yeah, just to put that into a little more medical terminology.
Please, thank you. Not my birthday.
Yeah, no, it went beautifully existentially. But if anybody knows anything about genetic testing, Huntington's disease is a genetic disorder, and since 1992, you could get a blood test to confirm whether or not you have a disorder. And I will say, I've been in the research. This is part of my dissertation, my concentrate, etc. But whether you have a positive or negative diagnosis of this disease, depression is a natural consequence of that. For at least a year, positive or negative, you either get survivor's guilt or you get, you get to somehow emotionally take on this terminal diagnosis. So yes, genetic counselors have reached out to me. I sit on the board for the Michigan Huntington's Disease Society, the Michigan chapter, head of their family services. That's why I get all of these questions. And yeah, it's essentially, permission to receive, do you have the correct mental state to where you will not kill yourself if you get this, if you get this test? And I think everybody, who wants this test, should be, that it should be available. The way we're framing this type of assessment is, do you have the support? Do you have the support to handle this? Because one of our themes is, no one should suffer alone. And I know that goes against the existential piece of it, but that's for another thing. But yeah, I am not in the business of denying anybody the right to know what's going to happen with their, with their life. I'm going to get off that. Back off. Thanks.
And I think of support as both support in the environment and the support of an existential framework, perhaps, that can hold that journey.
Thank you. No, that was really wonderful to hear more about your work, Andrea, because I know we've, especially since the pandemic, been working so much in isolation. So it's always nice to hear what colleagues are doing. It also makes me think about some of the client right now with some genetic struggles, and it's making me think about that case in a little bit of a different way. So I appreciate that. I know that you had wanted to present a case. Is that still on the table?
Absolutely. I also know that I just talked for a pretty long time if anybody else wants to do it.
Well, I'll buy you some. I can buy you some time if you want to have a few breaths. And I'll just brag about y'all a little bit more. One thing that's been really fun as watching you in the transition as your professor to now your supervisor and your colleague is most of you and most of us have practicums and internships in truly managed care in community mental health, where there are limited numbers of sessions and you are encouraged to get your client in and out. And then you come into private practice and I don't know, around week 2, you're panicking because you don't have it all figured out. And by week 3 or 4, you're thinking about discharge planning. And I have to remind you, hey, you can slow down. You know, my magic number is 8 sessions before you even have a clue. But people are going to tell you things at the year mark that suddenly explain everything. Doesn't mean you weren't working really hard up to that point, but it means it takes a long time sometimes for them to trust you. And so I have really enjoyed encouraging everybody to take the time needed. And when we largely got rid of, when mental health parity kicked in and there were less limits placed on sessions, I think we all breathed a sigh of relief because we knew maybe we could actually hit that year mark and wait for the big reveal and for the type of intimacy and trust that really good therapy needs. So it's been fun watching you sort of stop panicking and settle down and settle in and go on the long rides with your clients. And I'm afraid it's back to you now, Andrea.
The panic ended just before the pandemic began for me. But yeah, thank you. So to sort of introduce a case study, I know I just talked a lot about somebody with, a population with chronic illness, but the case study that I'm going to talk to you all very briefly about is 21-year-old woman who essentially came to me on a little break from college. She graduated college early. I will call her Nadia for our little pseudonym. But she had a lot of trouble getting out of bed. She had this, essentially DSM-wise, okay, she met criteria for initially adjustment disorder with depressed mood, trouble getting out of bed, apathy. I sat with her for quite a while, so 6 months, to where she eventually met criteria for, major depression. But so there's the billable piece of that. Goals were wanting to overcome depression. Goals were also wanting to improve her relationships, building, healthy interpersonal relationships, overcoming some anxiety, about the next steps ahead, and, entering, medical school and things like that. So there is my, managed care treatment plan in clinically, acceptable language, where an auditor would be like, oh yes, you're doing all the things in all of the treatment plans that you're doing billable work, right? I will say after about session 2, we very quickly got into existential themes. She had very quickly, graduated college, got into medical school early, and she had a semester off where her friends didn't. She lost a few, a significant group of friends, and so a lot of isolation, a lot of inner critic. What is wrong with me? Why am I, I'm lonely, I'm isolated. This time I thought I was going to enjoy. The pandemic was coming. Okay, and the pandemic eventually did come, which exacerbated all of this, got us into themes of, death, meaning, purpose, absurdity, right? But, what we really started talking about was what does it mean for her to take these next steps? What does it mean for her to take on the identity of a doctor in the future, right? Because right now she had no identity at the time. It was a college student, 21-year-old, to a lot of nothingness, right? So that void, what do I do with this time? I believe, to quote her, and this is jogging my memory, was, I didn't plan for that. And I said, it's hard to plan for a break, right? Especially when we're, used to, if you are going at the rate that, that she was going, having a break meant maybe having the opportunity to take an hour lunch instead of, having, 3 months off, right? You may not know how to plan for that. So a lot of our conversations were very existential, right? She has the tools, she has the ability, she has the means, to, do the journaling, do the exercise, do the mindfulness. What was, I think she was holding on to this old identity as a college student in, bachelor's degree and what that meant. And she was waiting to embrace this identity as a med student, what matched her expectations. Okay, I will say once COVID came, those expectations were definitely turned upside down. Okay, but in the interim, right, our first few months, she didn't have any identity of who am I? I don't know who I am in this void, and what does that mean? And for her, it was very depressing. It was very isolating. It was very lonely. And we helped her find, right, accessing that power within, that connection to herself, right? Talking about what is meaningful for her in, without having meaningful for her in the space, in the space of, I'm not, it's going to be a long time before I have 3 months off, right? Honestly, probably retirement, or unless you take a sabbatical, right? So what that meant for her in the meantime, what it meant for her to let go of that identity of undergrad student, right? General undergrad, high achieving, right? What it meant for her to let go of that by choice, because I think what was outside of her choice was when graduation came, she was like, oh, she was just sort of left, there. So it was helping her find that inner power, finding how to move through relationships. She would quite just sort of let relationships, sort of happen. And we would talk about, who do you want to be friends with? What do you want in a relationship? What do you, right? And then also that responsibility of, many people will come your way, right? Who do you want to connect with? Who do you want to maintain those, bonds with? And what does that look like for you, right? Nobody will take those steps for you. Nobody can live your life for you. There are certain choices that you have to make. And also, there's only so far you can go. You cannot live for anyone else. So a lot of those existential discussions. So I will say before I can talk about this forever. So that was a lot of our treatment, and my gentle challenges to her was, what do you feel comfortable? What are the choices you're going to take going forward, into this next week? I'm going to call somebody. I'm going to text somebody. I will let them, respond. Building relationships that were, mutual, as opposed to either waiting for somebody to, reach out to her. Right? We talked about that is an option, and this is, what has happened in the past, what is happening now. What would it be like for you to overcome that fear of reaching out? Are you ready to do that, right? So a lot of those types of discussions that I will say, to translate back to, this billable treatment plan, this billable hour, is how to communicate, is when are you ready and willing to change up the way you've sat with people, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't change who you are, right? So changing, behavior in a way that is comfortable, but not changing your values, right? Nobody's asking you to be somebody you are not. And it was a very beautiful type of movement where she was like, no, this is comfortable. I mean, I could see the choice and the internal power as she developed these healthier relationships, right? And being able to, so going back to being an existential therapist and being able to speak, CBT and interpersonal too. I put some, that the relationship work was quite interpersonal, that way. That readiness for change, and that, what I call it was that readiness to overcome fear, right? Fear of what happens if I let go of my old self and embrace my new self for a moment, And what happens, right? You know, because at least with old patterns, we know what to expect, whether they're comfortable or not. Being able to apply that courage to, you know, these new patterns and say, you know, a consequence will happen either way, right? Maybe this time something new will happen, but nobody is forcing you to do that. You do that when you choose. You do that when you feel comfortable enough to do something uncomfortable. Isn't that a mouthful? Okay. But that was, you know, a good amount of our work. And I'm still meeting with this person. So far, so good. It's still going pretty well. I'm going to stop it there because.
Oh, but you're not, because I have heard this presentation before, and one of my favorite parts were the salient modes of world. Remember those?
Yep. Let's see. Yeah, well, let's go there. Got my cheat sheet going on here. So I will say that, you know, really those salient modes of world, we wanted to really increase her presence in the social, right? So what I saw her do was become more present in her relationships. And I saw that in terms of, you know, she would come and say, Andrea, they responded, they invited me. I didn't have to invite myself to a situation, or I didn't get overlooked for an invitation. So she was more present, she was more included. She was more apt to communicate her needs, you know, if she wasn't. And she felt more seen, as opposed to being very invisible. And this is something that her words, I'm really struggled with this feeling of invisibility. So through our work, she was able to be more seen and present in her relationships. That was one aspect. The other portion was to increase her strength of self, right? Her internal sense of self. You know, so the personal piece of that. And, you know, again, going from that more passive standpoint of these things are happening to me and I have no power to move through it. I just have to experience it, or it just happens, you know, to me. We really got her talking to from the I position of, yes, this is happening and I am doing this to counter that.
Thank you. If we were live, I probably would have a little bag of snack candies, like the Halloween size candies, and I'd be tossing them out to people brave enough to talk. But pretend I gave you candy, anybody in the audience too. I'm tossing you a piece of candy if you can name those two worlds by their German names in the chat. And next time I see you at a conference, I will give you a piece of candy or buy you a beer, depending. Thanks, Andrea. I guess while we're talking about the chat, now's a good time to encourage not just questions, but comments. We have a little bit of time. And in the event that we don't see any questions or comments, I'll ask my panelists to be thinking of one piece of advice they might give to a new existential humanistic therapist. So we'll just take a second to see what's happening in the chat, and if we don't get anything, we'll let you go last, Andrea, because you've been in the hot seat for a while. All right, well, I'll keep an eye on the chat. If the rest of you would like to think of some pieces of advice you might give somebody early career.
So I think about a couple different things, and one is that being an existential humanistic psychologist is going to stretch you in way as a clinician and also as a person in ways you didn't think were possible. So one of those ways is you are often explaining, kind of like everybody has talked about, existential and humanistic ideas through a CBT very managed care based lens, and that can get really, really exhausting. But it can also be really rewarding because we know that we're doing the work, and we also know then that the work of EH therapy can translate into other domains, and that's a good thing. The other piece of advice I would give is to stay faithful to Maslow's hierarchy and the givens. Maslow's hierarchy explains why people might be stuck, and the givens explain why people feel the way that they feel. So I feel like those two very simple concepts within existential humanistic psychology govern a lot of my work. And I would encourage anybody new to look at those very closely.
Sam.
I'd say the advice I'd give that I've thought a lot about since I read about it. I read an article that said 90% of therapists think that they're in the top third of the best therapists. So never, don't get complacent, keep learning. You're never going to know everything, but I suspect the more you learn, the more it'll be easy to kind of gracefully use existential stuff within the world of managed care or CBT, which may ultimately have a better outcome if you're able to kind of have a bit of integrative, an integrative identity. Like for myself, I kind of think of, like, if I'm Batman is existential with a CBT utility belt. Like, that's just how I like to think about it. And there's no problem with that. That's sort of okay. I don't like, I cringe whenever I read something purely CBT in terms of their philosophy, but do I use reframing sometimes? Absolutely. It doesn't have to be a battle all the time. And I think the more you learn, the more you can make conscious, deliberate choices on it and what fits you as a person and as a therapist.
So you got a smile there out of Derek when you said Batman with the CBT tool belt. And Derek also gets the candy or the beer for naming the Umwelt and the Mitwelt. Well done, Derek. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that up at some point.
All right, I'll look forward to it.
As far as in terms of advice I would offer to a new therapist, I would say that because you're a therapist doesn't mean you're done growing as a person, and that you're going to grow more as a clinician and as an individual through your work and alongside your work. And if you find yourself thinking you're done, then you should really reassess that and continue to grow for the rest of your life. And also, just as a note, working in the here and now is really a transformative thing you can do as a clinician. And that's really something to start incorporating early and often as you're able.
I was an assessment TA, and one of my students stayed by after class, and they were doing a practicum at a crisis center. Adam, something you had said had made me think of this, what I would tell a new aspiring, hopefully existential clinician. I don't know what her orientation was, but she's at Michigan School. I'll bet you it's somewhere in that realm. And she was getting really hard on herself for saying, all I did was hand this client some food. That's all I did. That's all I did. And I said, so I brought her back to, the hierarchy of needs. I said, do you think you did enough? I said, what was that person looking for? Were they hungry? Were they out of the cold? Yes. Were they, so what were they looking for, from you, right? With all of these other, processes going on, were you really hoping to get them to self-actualize when they are starving? I said, so speaking to your own inner critic, did you do enough? And I said, I would invite you to that be a yes. And I said, is that the only thing you'll ever do? No, because hopefully they'll come back. Right? But was that enough for now? So, and in terms of what I would, tell new existential, therapists, I know the way I work, I hold a lot of stories, I hold a lot of, death, right? A lot of those existential, themes, and I consciously have centered myself around very strong, very supportive clinicians as well. I think, doing, clinical psychology is not something you should be doing in isolation anyways, but also understanding that, knowing that your clients are not holding this alone, you are not holding this alone as well, and you are just as deserving of that space to heal with, others who, know confidentiality and stuff, who understand. Also taking that responsibility onto yourself to make sure that you can hear the stories you choose to hold, and make sure to seek help for yourself when you need to heal.
Those are great reminders. Thank you. I'll direct your attention to the chat where Brian has reminded us that phenomenology, he says, he finds phenomenology to be the ticket for documenting change without having to fall into CBT language, direct descriptions of shifts in behavior, similar to my get a girlfriend goal. Thank you, Brian. And then he goes on to say he thinks the why and the toward what. He thinks why and toward what when we apply strategies makes a big difference for what type of goals they serve. And that lets him consider reframing an existential invitation. I totally agree. So there's that wordsmithing that I think we're all so good at. I think my advice, I will quote Ram Dass and say, be here now, which speaks to Brian's invitation into the here and now as the most potent place to work. And then my women's group of, 13 years, somewhere in the middle, they decided that the truth should always fit on a sticky note. It would be small enough to fit on a sticky note. It might be 8 or 10 words when you finally got to the bottom. And that most things were solved by telling the truth faster than you might feel inclined to tell it. I can use that as a therapist, although timing is everything. And I often, clients go, what should I do? And I say, well, what's the truth? And it's not their first thought. And there's often a surprise in being asked that question. So I would say, be here now and tell the truth faster. Those would be my pieces of advice. Okay, I don't see anything else in the chat. So, but wait, there's more. Kirk is here. Hi, Kirk. I agree about phenomenology, and I might add presence as an ever-sensitive guide to the intimately relevant. Yes, thank you for that. We have enough time if you'd like to say a little bit about that, Kirk. We'd love to have you.
I just very much enjoyed your presentations, and as you know, I've been immersed in this, what I would call an existential integrative perspective for a long time, and encouraging our opening to, well, that Superman analogy. That's interesting. The existentialist upholding maybe the broader view, the larger view, but having a number of skills on her, his, their tool belt. So I like that. Yeah, I was just speaking to, fine-tuned presence is so important, it seems to me, in the training of therapists who are willing to take the deeper, larger perspective toward healing. And it has a lot to do with using your whole body experience as a barometer for what's relevant, what's significant at this moment. I mean, I define presence as the holding and illuminating of that which is palpably significant within the client and between you and the client. So it's got a very powerful holding, supportive, safety function, as well as a kind of a space to then deepen and explore. And it's kind of, I don't know what that paper is called where the colors can bleed through, but it provides that kind of indication of what is being called for here. What is the client's desire and capacity for deeper change or more experiential contact with themselves and the therapist and the world? And people have a whole range of capacities to heal, to change. But I think the great problem is that too rarely is that range offered, and you all are offering that range. I think somebody mentioned that too often CBT or the medical intervention is the be all and end all. I think that's our biggest problem. So
Thank you. What an honor to have you share the space with us and share your thoughts. And I'm sure
Great.
Dylan's pleased as punch that you liked his Superman analogy
appreciate
there.
it. One other thing I'll mention is I do believe that as people go deeper, if they're willing and able to go deeper into their struggle, often the less they can be reached through verbal or interpretive modes, the more relevant mode is the being there that we've been talking about. That sort of pre-verbal kinesthetic holding, supporting, accompanying. Because to categorize it in any way is a desecration, really, often, for that person. You can't wrap a category around, the sense of being in free fall or of being invisible or being in a black hole. I mean, you also start hearing these existential metaphors more and more when people are in those extremely intense primal places, groundlessness of existence. And I think our job at that point is so crucial in doing what we can to help the person find some kind of ground, some kind of foothold within the groundlessness. That's a wonderful calling. So I'll shut up at that point.
Thank you. I hear you describing the what I call the being hyphen with, the sacred being hyphen with.
It's nicely put, yeah.
All right, well, I want to thank today's panelists for this rich exploration of truly the lived experience of being an EH therapist in a managed care environment. I'd also like to thank the Society for Humanistic Psychology for their continued commitment to protect and promote EH psychology's voice in the larger paradigm of the APA and in the world. Adam, I think we were going to let you have sort of a political call here toward the end, if you'd like.
Thanks, Betz. Yes, always. So what I wanted to just close with is I really want to encourage mental health professionals, and in particular humanistic psychologists, to get involved and work to bring humanistic principles into the public arena a little more deeply. It's interesting, we will actually only, unless there are other, there are only 2 psychologists currently serving in Congress, and one of them is retiring at the end of the year. It's not seeking re-election. None in the Senate, and no governors or psychologists either. So I really encourage people to get involved, making sure that our laws reflect the principles that govern what we do, reflect the principles of humanistic psychology. It was put in the chat, I believe, by Dr. Dubose about Cyan, which is a really wonderful organization. They do a lot of really fantastic citizen lobbying efforts in order to educate lawmakers about the therapies of depth, including existential humanistic psychology. And I definitely think that's worth looking into. I also think getting involved in APA is, they need our voice. They need people to hear what we're saying. It's very important. And finally, running for office yourself. While it may not seem easy or glamorous, it's more doable than most people think. And I heavily encourage it because you'll find that the skill set for being a politician and the skill set for being a psychologist are very, very similar. Listening to problems, working to solve them, helping people to empower them to come up with some solutions. So I heavily encourage it. Thank you all for coming. And with that said, I will turn it back over to Betz.
Thanks, Adam. So for those paying attention, oh, wait. Okay, I'll direct you to the CE information again is over in the chat. For those of you paying attention to the programming today, you're going to notice that the live presentations have a really lovely arc. Lewis Hoffman started us off this morning exploring the making of an EH therapist. And now we've discussed launching these EH therapists into their early career environments, which often include the challenges of managed care. And then later this evening, Andrew Bland is going to talk about the importance of bringing this training into academic educational spheres. We will stay on. I will keep this Zoom open for a bit in case anyone wants to talk or has questions for the presenters. I also want to invite you all to visit the exhibition hall where the posters are. There's some really great posters this year. I'm excited about them. So if you've got time, give them a look. And of course, you've got access to all the pre-recorded materials as well. So thank you again for joining us and for the work that you all do. You're welcome to go and you're welcome to stay. I'm finally going to look and see who's here. I didn't let myself look.